I'm here at the Global Underwater Hub stand with Chief Executive Neil Gordon. Thank you for joining us. Tell us, there have been so many rich discussions been happening at offshore Europe over the past couple of days. I know that you've been holding lots of talks yourself. What have been the themes coming out of them? What are the main takeaways?
The main takeaways we found that this is still a very huge, important event for people to come to talk about what's happening in the industry. And I think we found, particularly from the Global Underwater Hub, is our sector is such an important part of that energy transition. Oil and gas is still at the heart of our energy security in the UK. But many companies are trying to establish, well, what does the future hold? Everyone is talking about being very busy. There's a lot of things going on, and oil and gas is very prevalent. But some of the challenges, a lot of the companies are thinking, well, what is beyond? So we're looking at particular areas in renewables, in fixed and floating wind. And floating wind for our sector, particularly when it comes to technology and things like dynamic cables, which is very similar to umbilicals in oil and gas. Dynamic cables are going to be a real technological challenge. Also, mooring and anchoring systems are going to be another area of opportunity for the subsea community. But what we've found is we've had a lot of international visitors, a lot of meetings with folk that we've dealt with internationally previously, but also new countries from around the world are looking to learn from the UK and what we've done, because the UK is certainly seen as a leader in, as we call this, net zero journey and energy transition. But there's a lot of conversation certainly coming from the likes of the energy ministers talk yesterday about how important to maintain and make sure that that transition overlaps and there isn't a gap, because the transition is about a move from one to the other, but the two have got to overlap with each other and try and maintain, I suppose, the capacity and the capability that we have in the UK.
It's 4 years since everybody met face to face at an offshore Europe, and the main topics of discussion have certainly changed over the last 4 years, with energy transition topping that agenda. But Global Underwater Hub is an organisation which has gone through its own transition in the last 4 years too.
Yeah, we went a number of years ago, looked at the blue economy and the size of the blue economy and what that meant for the underwater sector or the subsea sector. So the transition was about how do we position our supply chain in the UK for the blue economy. So moving from a high carbon industry to a low carbon industry is what we saw. So we went through that transition to try and be inclusive of all the sectors in the blue economy, but also inclusive of all the regions across the UK. So that meant using the companies or using the technologies that have been developed in oil and gas to apply that in renewables and offshore wind. So if you think about seabed survey for pipelines for oil and gas, it's the same seabed survey for laying cables on the seabed. So there's a transition been on the go for some time in the subsea sector. But also thinking about wave and tidal. What about subsea infrastructure, security, defence? What about aquaculture, wave and tidal? Many of the technologies or the capabilities are very transferable. So that's why we went through a transition to understand what that meant for the country, but also what it meant for our member companies and help them understand what's coming. And that's the challenge, I think, in coming to an event like this, hopefully gets a bit more understanding of what direction of travel there is in policy making. And the opportunities and what the technologies that are required and how to commercialise and win business in some of those areas. So it is a very confusing landscape, I would say, in the energy and the blue economy, and a lot of that is driven by many things happening around the world, and some of them that we're not in control of, particularly when we looked at what happened in Ukraine. It's changed the dynamics of energy, the costs. It's changed energy security, the perception of that. But it's also given us let's say, an opportunity to look at ourselves and say, well, what are we really good at and what can we export around the world? And I go back to that one about defence and energy security, as well as subsea infrastructure security, where we'll be looking at in the future, how do we protect what we have around our shores and be able to export that capability around the world in the future.
And finally, Neil, I know how passionate you are about representing the supply chain. and making sure that their voice is heard throughout industry and also at government level. Here at Offshore Europe, a number of the supply chain companies who are members of the Global Underwater Hub will be here. I take it you've been meeting them and having discussions with them in this arena.
Yeah, we've had lots of discussions on the stand and trying to get out to meet. It has been so busy, but the enthusiasm for the what we're doing within the hub is really showing. It's about understanding where the industry is positioned now and where we need to take the industry. But we've also had some great meetings with the ministers recently, and they're listening carefully to understand that we need to have a very strong capability that's resilient in the change. So having that pipeline of opportunities from existing traditional markets as well as the new markets and bringing them, so we don't lose that UK capability, which particularly in the subsea space and the underwater space, that we're world renowned. So we are now getting that traction. Our members are really engaged with us, and now we're really getting engaged with government to help us align some of those things to make sure we get the best from both worlds.
Super, Neil. Always good to get your thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine.